Since the beginning of time, humans have learned through stories. That is, if you really want people to understand and remember your material, you tell it in terms of a story. Since the very beginning, you think about people around a campfire, and the elders would come back to the camp and would tell stories about their exploits out in the wilderness. And people would understand. They would listen to that and they would hear that, and then they would be better equipped. Think about humans. When we went out to the mountaintops and we lived on the mountaintops, how did we figure that out? And we went and learned to fish and we learned to live in the desert. And how was all of that possible? Well, it was possible because we told each other stories. And we have, in humans, we have something called the amygdala in our brain. And this is a little piece of our brain that is like an experience simulator. That is, you think about a flight simulator. Now, if you have somebody that wants to be a pilot, you don't put them in a plane and let them go fly. You put them in a simulator and you let them go simulate flying. And so they go out and they fly and they take off and they land, they take off and they land, and they have all sorts of things, but it all happens in the simulator. And so that by the time they get in an actual cockpit, they've had lots and lots and lots of hours of experiencing that. And our amygdala makes it appear to our brains as if it was actually happening. If you take somebody and you put them in an MRI machine and you watch their electronic impulses in their brain and you tell them a story about shooting basketball, their brain will fire off as if they're actually shooting basketball. And then you tell them a story about being in love and their brain will fire off as if they're actually in love. And so it's when we tell people a story, it's different than telling them information. Because if I tell you information, you process it logically. But when I tell you a story, you process it with a different part of the brain, and it feels as if it's actually happening to us. You ever go see a James Bond movie? And when you're walking out of the theater, you feel like James Bond for just a little while? And you get in the car and I've got an old Dodge van, and you're driving that van like you're James Bond. What happened to us? What happened to us was it was so real to us that we felt like it was really happening to us. And so we retained that for a very long time. Many of us can remember stories from our childhood that our grandfather may have told us, or even our great-grandfather. Many of us can remember a story that's been told to us for 5 or 10 or 15 years later. I was talking about Zig Ziglar. I remembered for a period of time, I listened to his tapes all the time, and I could recite everything that Zig Ziglar said almost verbatim, and even with that accent. The thing is, that's the way we learn. You think about it. Somebody asked Jesus, said, "Why do you tell parables?" Well, a parable is a story. Why do you tell parables? Because he said, I teach and they don't learn. I talk and they don't listen. The stories are what makes people remember. Do you remember Bible stories? Of course we do. Daniel in the lion's den. David and Goliath. Those stories live with us forever. But the information that you're delivering may not live with us for 5 minutes because it's not told in a story form. So we're going to talk about how to tell better stories. Now, we are not professional storytellers, and we're not telling stories just to be entertaining. We're not making James Bond movies. We want to get something across. We want to get a point across. And so we have a takeaway, but we also understand that if we have this takeaway, that the best way that we can get people to remember it for a long time is if we attach it to a story. And so we're telling this story only in service to communicate the information. Tell the story, tell us the takeaway. Tell the story, tell us the takeaway. And that's the way this works. We're not entertainers. We're not there just to tell. Here's a story. We're not doing James Bond movies. We're telling stories in order to communicate the information. So we have to start with the takeaway. What is the takeaway that we want people to walk away with? And then back into the story, and then tell a story that then concludes with the takeaway, and tell them what that takeaway is. Now, how long should a story be? Well, long enough to be powerful, long enough to be important, but it doesn't have to be that long. A lot of really functional stories are just a line or two. There's a meme that goes around on the internet sometimes that says, here's how other people tell a story, and it's got this simple process, and then here's how I tell a story, and it's got this complex process. But I have a friend whose mom said she said, Emily, and if you met Emily, you'd love this. Emily said her mom told her, Emily, your beginning of your story is here and your ending of your story is here. And your job is to make them come close together as is possible. And I think that's just charming. And if you know Emily, she's just like that. She's just an adorable person. And she does go on for quite a long time. But that her mom is right and not right at the same time. Is that we don't necessarily need to tell short stories for it to work. As a matter of fact, Jerry Seinfeld said that the idea of an attention span is kind of BS. That there's not an infinite attention span if we are being entertained. And that's true. The kids that go home from school and they're in trouble at school because they can't pay attention, and maybe they should have, some kind of intervention or some kind of a drug in order to get them to be able to sit still. And then they go home, what do? They play Minecraft for like 9 hours without getting up. Well, it's when it's entertaining, we have infinite attention span. And you telling a good story, well, it kind of doesn't matter how long it is, but you can tell effective short stories, just a line or two. But it's important that we can include stories if we're going to make it work. Now, one of the best things we can do is tell our own story. It's, really effective. Especially if you have some history, and chances are if you're teaching a particular idea, the reason you're teaching is because you had some prior history of that. And so if you tell your own story, fantastic. The caution I would have is don't be the hero of your own story. You don't want to tell the story like, oh man, I am so smart. Let me just share with you how smart I am about this stuff. Because nobody likes that, You go to a dinner party and the last thing you want to hear is somebody bragging about how cool they are and how smart they are. That's just not good. As a matter of fact, just the opposite is worth doing. Self-deprecating stories really work well. If you say, listen, Janet, I understand. People are struggling with this. I struggled with this. Man, I was here for like 2 years and I didn't know how to do the basic thing on that form. And, and now I know it, but it took me 2 years to learn. It's not going to take you 2 years because you're smarter than I am. But you understand, using self-deprecating humor helps because it makes your audience connect with you. If you make yourself sound like the smartest person ever, then nobody connects with you. If you can, always tell your story in present tense. That is, instead of saying Amelia Earhart did, past tense, you tell it Amelia Earhart does, like it's telling present tense. So Amelia Earhart is missing the island, and she doesn't know how much longer she has before she runs out of gas. What she doesn't know is that the radio transmitter on the island hasn't worked. What she doesn't know is that the calculation on her trip has been miscalculated. What she doesn't know is where she's going to land. It has a certain immediacy to it when you tell a story in present tense that it doesn't have if you tell it in past tense. How do you get people to listen to your story? Now, chances are good that there's nobody sitting around going, oh my goodness, I hope Daniel tells me a story. What we do is we invite them in. We invite them to be a part of it. So if your story has to do with somebody who gets really angry, you might say, have you ever been angry? Really? Have you ever been angry? How many of you have been angry this week, right? Have you ever been so angry that you begin making just sounds you can't even form whole words? And then you launch into your story. What you've done is you've got them to open up and to become mentally part of the story, because now they're playing it along in their heads as if it's actually happening to them. Details are important, but we need the right amount of details, not too many details, and it gets to be too much, and too few, and you don't feel like you're actually there. You probably have this. I've got an Uncle Earl. You ever have an Uncle Earl? You have an Uncle Earl that somebody asks him a question and he tells you how the watch is made. He just goes on. And you're there at Christmas time and you walk in and you go, hey, Earl, hey, I love your shirt. And everybody kind of groans because they know that now Uncle Earl is going to spend 45 minutes telling you about his shirt. That's not the way to do it. Too much detail isn't the way, but also too few details and you don't feel like you're actually there. And so the good way to do this is to give us a visual, give us something auditory, give them something that we feel, and give us something that we smell. You don't have to have all of them, but if I am there, what would I see, smell, hear, touch? Give me a couple of details and I'll be there. So I could tell you, on my birthday, in 2002, I was sitting in a brand new Mazda Miata. Had Italian leather seats. Can you feel that Italian leather? Man, it's fantastic. Had the top down. It was in Nashville, Tennessee, and honeysuckle was blooming, and it smelled fantastic. And we're listening to the radio, and it's Al Jarreau playing on the radio. So I can give you like 2 or 3 details, and you're right there with me. People love puzzles. And so if you can, make your story into a puzzle. Don't tell us the outcome. Tell us the situation, and then we'll be curious about the outcome. If you're flipping through the newspaper and you see the Times crossword puzzle there, you immediately begin trying to solve the problems. If you see Sudoku, you'll start trying to solve that almost immediately. So if you tell it in terms of a puzzle, then people get involved in it. And sometimes we make the mistake of telling the story backwards. We tell the outcome, and then we tell how hard it was to get to the outcome. For instance, we didn't know what was wrong with this young man. Healthy, strong, athletic even. And one day he's sitting on his chair and he just leans forward and falls onto the concrete in front of him. Breaks his head open. And we looked and we couldn't figure out what it was. We did all of the tests, and at first we thought it was this and it didn't work out. We tried this and it didn't work out. We tried this, and everything that we tried failed to produce the results that we were looking for. And one day a man walked in and he said, "Oh, I think I understand what this is. My cousin has Crohn's disease." And we went, "Oh, Crohn's. That's what it is." But if you tell the outcome before you tell the puzzles, keep us engaged. So if you can, keep us engaged by telling us the puzzle first, and then we'll solve it along the way. One of the questions I get a lot is they say, how much does the story need to be absolutely journalistically perfect? And how much can it be sort of made up? Well, let's step back for a minute. Why are we telling the story? We're not telling the story for our sake. We're not telling the story to make ourselves... if you tell a story about being shot down in Vietnam or something, you're doing that to make yourself feel better, to make people think better of you. But in this case, we're telling the story because we want them to understand something. We're here to educate and to elevate. I had a chance where I had a bunch of speakers, and a bunch of speakers were leaving this event. And we were going to get on a bus and go to the airport. And there's maybe 6 of us. And then the dentist took our bus. The dentist just walked out right in front of us and got on the bus and took off. And so we had to wait for another bus, and it was another 20 minutes. So I had a chance to talk to these professional speakers that speak all the time, all over the country, and many of them get a lot of money for doing that. And I asked them, I said, how important is it that the story we tell be journalistically perfectly accurate? And the consensus after a long discussion was this: it doesn't have to be. Because our stories are not there for us to tell. We're not on trial. We're not writing it in the newspaper. No one's going to come back to us later and say, "No, wait a minute. You said this, and it was this." We're there to educate and elevate. We are there to make their world better. We're there to help other people out. And if sometimes the story works better, if it happens like this rather than this, then that's fine. You understand? Our stories are serve the purpose of making the listener understand things. And so sometimes we reorganize our stories to make them fit better. As much as possible, we want to be able to find the emotion in the story. You can learn something and not really feel it. If you learn something, you may know it, but you don't feel it. That you need to be able to feel it. And if you can find the emotion in that story, then that's a story that will remain with people for a very long time. If there's an emotional moment in there, then look for the emotion, because the emotion will connect us back to that story a long time from now. And then we need to make sure that we close our story. If you open a story, we need to be able to close it. I'll give you an example. Had a young lady in one of our classes, and she was talking about raising money for a children's hospital. She did a good job, and she was there for a good reason. And so it was great. But here's what she said. She said something to the effect of, when I had my son, she said that the baby was born, and then instead of handing the son to me, as was customary, they put the son in a incubator, and they raced him out the room. And when I asked the nurse, I said, "What's going on?" The nurse looked at me and said poignantly, "If we don't do something for your son right now, he's going to die." And this speaker went on to talk about the great hospital, the great care, fantastic organization, and why we should be donating money to them. And she sat down. She was done. And I was like, okay. And I went around the room and I asked everybody, I said, "Do you have any questions for Karen?" And nobody wanted to say anything. They had questions, but they didn't want to say anything. And so being the coach, I had to be the one to say, "Karen, what happened to your baby?" And I was afraid that baby had died and this wasn't going to be a nice moment. And she laughed out loud. She said, "Oh no," she said, "the baby's fine. Baby's 17. He's applied for college and he's healthy and he's bigger than my husband is." See, if you don't close your story, then we're just left wondering. And so you have to, if you open a story, you have to close it. Here's what I want you to understand about storytelling, is that this storytelling is the work of a presenter. That is the work of the presenter. Go back to that Zig Ziglar example. He wanted us to remember this, this, and this, and this. But he also understood, as a great communicator, that there was no way we'd remember these things unless he attached them to stories. And so we have to understand the stories are there to help people hear it, understand it, get it, remember it, and be able to use it later. And in order to do that, we have to tell really good stories.